First, I would like to welcome you and let you know a bit about X-Camera series. In the pre-pandemic days, from May 2019 to mid-March 2020, we gathered at Fresh Ground Cafe, the Common Studio in downtown Kitchener, every Friday afternoon to hear a lecture by an interdisciplinary artist or professional. The lecture was followed by a usually lively question period. And then we stayed in the cafe, had lunch, and continued our conversation and built up a community. Those were great days. I miss them. It is in the spirit of supporting artists and continuing to build community that we have relaunched X-Camera on Zoom. The series will continue on Fridays at 1 for the foreseeable future. The talk will start soon, and Sydney will speak until about 1:50. Meanwhile, please feel free to type questions in the Zoom chat function as the lecture is going on. We will have question and answer period focused on the artist's work until about 2 o'clock. You are then welcome to hang out after the question period to meet each other. Let everyone know what you're doing or possibly discuss future collaborations. We are very pleased to welcome Sydney Lancaster, but first I will turn it over to Hannah Gardner for the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Catherine. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land. The Dish with One Spoon covenant is a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and the earth. We should only take what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, work, and learn.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks. It's my pleasure to welcome Sydney Lancaster here this afternoon. Although she's been involved in the arts for her whole life, Sydney devoted herself to a full-time practice as an artist about 15 years ago, and in her own words, has made herself very busy and hasn't looked back since. Sydney's work is truly multi- and interdisciplinary in nature as she engages in visual arts, including site-specific installation, sculpture, mixed media, and printmaking, as well as writing, video, and audio works. She has participated in residencies at Harcourt House, Alberta, Grouse Moor National Park, and her works have been presented in galleries and other venues in Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland. She has received support for her work from the Canada Council for the Arts, Alberta Arts Foundation, and the Edmonton Arts Council. She's also an arts advocate and activist, and she has served as a board member for several artist-run centers and as a representative for CARFAC, an organization founded in the 70s that sets standards and advocates for the fair payment of artists for their labor and expertise. On a personal note, I became interested in Sydney's work some time ago, and I've watched her career with interest for some time. I invited Sydney to speak for X-Camera a few months ago, and since then she's been attending these X-Camera talks with diligence, a proof that the arts community in Canada is close-knit and supportive, despite our expansive geography. The focus for Sydney's talk this afternoon will be a project called Make Equals Believe, an ongoing site-specific project that has been in development for the last several years. After speaking with Sydney, and in the spirit of the mandate of InterArts Matrix to support artists' processes in all of its stages, I gave Sydney an atypical opportunity to speak about a project that's ongoing and still in development. So it's a brave thing to do, to talk about a work that's still in progress, and I applaud Sydney for that, and I'm looking forward to this talk. Let's welcome Sydney.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and thank you to everybody at InterArts Matrix for inviting me to speak. It's a wonderful opportunity. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Amasquatchewascahagan, otherwise known as Edmonton, which is situated in Treaty 6 territory and Métis Region number 4. This place has been a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route for the Nihilwak, the Anishinaabe, the Blackfoot, the Dene, the Nakota Sioux, the Métis, and the Inuit. And it's a place now that is also shared by people from across the world. As a settler woman, I feel deeply the desire to listen and learn and share with generosity and understand my responsibilities within the systems that have dispossessed and silenced so many people here over the years. So my wish is to become a better ally and a better neighbor wherever I am. And that extends into virtual space now, which is, I think, a very important thing for us to recognize. So a little bit about me and a little bit about the project, and then I'm going to shift to visuals because it's a much easier way to understand this crazy thing that I've been working on for a while. In a nutshell, my work is very much rooted in unpacking relationships between place, objects, and different conceptions of memory. I'm really interested in looking at the different ways of knowing and creating meaning, and trying to find the gaps in those discourses and sort of peel them back and find out what else is there. I'm interested in those fragments of partially lost stories and reclaiming narratives and seeing how they fit or don't fit together over time. In the last few years, I've done a lot of site-specific work, place-based work. Sheila mentioned a residency I had at Grossmore National Park. That was a big project in 2014 that was looking at ideas of borders and boundaries in relation to deep time and geology and the way humans carve up the land and time to make it comprehensible. I've also worked on a project that was recently shown here in Edmonton called Macromareal with a wonderful collaborator, sound artist and composer, Scott Smallwood. That was looking at the tidal range in the Bay of Fundy and the various narratives around that. So oceanography, geology, social history, the history of shipbuilding, and Mi'kmaq traditional stories, understandings of the geology and the history of why the tides are there and how they became. Which leads me to this project, Make Believe. This has been, as Sheila said, a project that has been in progress for a long time. Basically, it started, I think, back in about 2011 when I approached two friends, a poet and a musician who have a small piece of land, about 5 acres, a couple of hours northeast of here, near Smoky Lake. And Janny and Mark had bought this piece of land about 17 years ago, and we're sort of reclaiming it. It had been a homestead, one of the early homesteads in the province, and the fellow who owned the 5 acres at the time had kind of let the place go, and so they took it on as a project. And as they were working on it, I had become very interested in looking at land-based, site-specific ways of making. So I asked Jenny and Mark, I have this crazy idea. can I come out to your farm and see if I can make a site-specific project on the land? And they said, yeah, sure, give it a shot. Why not? So I came out and discovered this amazing belt of Caragana. Now, I don't know enough about agricultural land in Ontario and various other parts of the country to comment on this, but Caragana is a hedge and windbreak plant that is used extensively on the Alberta prairies, but it's an import. And so there's lots of interesting things around that. I'm going to share my screen right now and start taking you through this crazy history and tell you a little bit more about Caragana hedges in the process. So, crossing my fingers that the technology works, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so what you're seeing on the screen here is Caragana hedge in midsummer. It's also known as Siberian peaberry, pea shrub. It's an invasive plant, and it was brought to the prairies by Eastern European homesteaders from Russia and Poland and the Ukraine, and used as a shelter belt and a windbreak when they were homesteading. This is a plant that I've been familiar with since childhood, and I used to play in Caragana hedges and windbreaks when I was growing up, building forts and making, imaginary worlds. So when I saw this shelter belt that had gone wild, it had just continued to grow on the farm. So it takes up probably almost a quarter of an acre now. I thought, okay, here's my thing. This is what I want to play with, and I want to play with that idea of making believe and finding alternative worlds, finding different ways of understanding. But the other thing that has been running through this project is also the idea of homesteading from the start, and that you clear land, you build a house, you plant a crop because you believe that you can build a life here. So there's a lot of resonances in the name as well. So I started playing with these trees. And what I wound up doing for the first few years was working in the space and physically weaving the branches together. And that was a really interesting process, and continues to be an interesting process, because it's very much a process where I have to relinquish authority and predetermined outcomes. From the start, it's been a very intuitive thing. I've had to learn from the trees what I can do and how I can work. And I also wanted to take pains to work with what was there. So the grove of trees as it was, rather than coming in with a plan of exactly where each room or each tunnel was going to be, and I'll remove everything that's extraneous or pull it out by the roots or whatever. I just wanted to work in the space as it was, so that it could talk to me about how best to work. So I started building these rooms and building these tunnels, and they became places to travel through. So there's this metaphorical quality of going into an alternate sort of space, an alternate universe, but also I was creating sort of points of refuge or places to stop and rest. And over the years, those tunnels and the rooms that I've built in this grove have very much become that. Kids have had, imaginary games and tea parties, and people have used some of the rooms to just sit and talk or meditate or make music or whatever. So there's this idea of moving through a space and moving through a threshold to something else, to discovery. But one of the greatest discoveries that I had, and that started a whole bunch of other directions with this project, was that the rooms in the tunnels were being used preferentially by a whole range of animals. And this guy, this amazing hare, was visiting one day with me when I was working. So I'm up on a step ladder in the middle of the largest space that I had created, which was a room that's approximately 10 feet in diameter. And I'm up on this step ladder weaving these branches together, and I noticed movement sort of down in my periphery. I looked down, and here's this hare stretched out Burt Reynolds-like on its belly, watching me work. And there was absolutely no fear there. There was no, I'm going to get up and run away, nothing. He sat there for 45 minutes and got up and groomed himself and stretched and did all his stuff, his rabbit thing, before he eventually decided to take off. So that was a very, very important moment for me, because it made me realize that I was a guest in their space. So not only was I relinquishing some of the authority that one can own as an artist in creating work in relationship to the trees, learning the limits on their terms, but the spaces that I was creating were also home to these creatures, and they were adopting them in new ways and making them their own. So this dialogue just kept on getting richer and getting deeper. So that led me to want to find a way, perhaps, to capture what I was doing through their eyes, through animal eyes. So what I did was attempted to do that in video. So I'm going to show you a little clip here. So one of the other things that I did was start to set up a couple of trail cameras in various positions in the tunnels and the rooms. So I'm going to just quickly go through some shots here. We've got, I do not know what that rabbit is doing, but it's kind of amazing. That was an amazing shot. There's a little weasel, a deer, a moose on one of the other trails, pheasant that decided to sort of take up space in one of the rooms. That's a little frog that I found in the outhouse at the farm. There's that hair again. So this started me really thinking about the idea of stewardship rather than simply maintenance. I'd spent several years working on this project off and on, in between other things, and there was there was an element of stewardship that was part of that, but in many ways, as I say, it was really just about maintenance. I would go out for a period of time and fix areas that were becoming weak, rework some of the rooms, extend things, keep on building new areas of the installation as it changed over time. And my thinking had been actually, in retrospect, quite narrow, because I had really been resistant to doing anything other than working with the living trees. Because to my thinking at the time, it felt like too much of my will was going to be tied to what I made with other things like deadfall in the grove. Because I could move it around and take it where I wanted and manipulate it in completely different ways that had nothing to do with the way the trees grew and where they were situated and rooted in the ground. But coming to the work this year, this crazy pandemic year, where I was very, very fortunate to receive a small grant from the Edmonton Arts Council to dig into this project, because I could do it in a socially distant way. I was off in the country, away from everybody, and I could go and work for days and days and days at a time, which was wonderful. I hadn't had that opportunity before. It shifted my thinking completely. Being able to take a real deep dive into this project. The grove, as I found it this year, was really healthy still. Lots of new growth and that kind of thing, but there was a great deal of deadfall that was actually becoming a fire hazard. And so that was something that I really had to consider in how I approached really working in a concentrated fashion in this place. So I began gathering all this deadfall and using the branches in concert with the living trees to build forms that reflected their shapes and the way they curve and bend as they grow. And a lot of these structures sort of take cues from nests and burrows and children's play forts and things like that. And what emerged in that process, which continued to be actually fairly sort of spontaneous and intuitive, was a whole series of forms, sculptural forms that were more actually quite like drawings in a lot of ways. That were sort of arches and apertures and sort of curved barriers and spaces that guided the eye and the body into the depth of the grove, into looking into it in a bunch of different ways. So probably the best way I can explain that to you is by showing you another video. So this is a walkthrough that I took in September of this year. So we were losing almost all the trees, all the leaves from the trees. There wasn't a lot left there. And there's a whole range of shapes that I created, as I said, around the trees themselves and the way they were growing or bending or whatever, that sort of serve as guideposts. And there were a number of small sculptures that I built out of green carragana, and lashed with hemp rope and jute rope that were sort of wayfinding markers, things like that. So it's about going in, finding your way, exploration, discovery, and also hiding and little bits of magic and finding little places to curl up. And it very much became a process of both looking outward and looking in as I was building these sculptures. It was a moment to reassess and shift my thinking about my responsibility to the place, my responsibility to the trees, and starting to understand a little bit more about the history of the land itself and what it meant to be a settler reworking a homestead that was settled by homesteaders, European homesteaders at the turn of the last century, but that was also Métis land and Indigenous land. So there was a looking back and a looking through different lenses that became manifest in these sculptural forms, and being able to actually stick your head through some of these apertures and see a different way of looking at the land became quite important to me as I was working. So the other thing that happened this summer, which was really exciting for both me and for Jani in having this opportunity to do a deep dive, was to really start doing a lot of research and come to terms with the history of the place, the land. This is the farmhouse, which is well over 100 years old now, and which has been refurbished extensively, shored up and all kinds of things by Jani and Mark. There's some shots on the left of your screen. That's the inside of the barn, which is a testament to this incredible hard work. Those are hand-hewn logs that were chinked with mud and straw that went into building that barn. It's mind-boggling the amount of incredible physical labor that went into clearing and homesteading this space. This beautiful old map on the left is on the wall inside the barn. That little circle there gives you the approximate location of where we are in relation to bushland and parkland and prairie in Alberta. The image on the right of your screen shows where the farm is now, the little 5 acres. And I want to draw your attention to those interesting plots of land along the river that are not in the grid. Those are Métis lands. And they were settled before the European settlers came, and the Dominion Land Survey came and cut up everything into nice, neat little squares. So there's a lot of history around this place that needs to be explored. The map on the left shows you that's Lobstick Settlement, the Métis lands that I showed you in the previous slide. The red circles in both of the maps there show you the original quarter section that was settled by Terenti Terenko, who came over from Eastern Europe at the turn of the last century. And thank you, Google Maps. The image on the upper right is an aerial satellite view of the farm, the little tiny farm that was once part of this whole quarter section. And the wee tiny little orange oval inside there is where I'm working. So we started to do some research. Janny and I have really started to dig into the history, and we're finding some really interesting things. So it's going to be a while yet before I can ever call this done, but there's some really exciting directions to take this, and I'm not sure where it's going to go yet. So, but I'm excited. So here we go. Here's again the location of the farm, lobstick settlement. Something in starting to dig around into the history of the area. Janny found a mention of a chief bear's ears, and then hit a dead end. So we kept on digging, and discovered that at one point in time, very close to the farm and to lobstick settlement, there was also Bears Ears Indian Reservation number 126, which you can see marked on the satellite map on the upper left near the lobstick settlement along the river, and also on the map behind. Now that reservation was formed towards the very end of the 19th century, but then it was taken back by the government, and Bears Ears tribe was moved to Saddle Lake. So it disappears from the map. So this is where the really interesting stuff starts to come together for this project. I would love to find out where all these folks are, where their descendants are. Are they still in Saddle Lake? Are they in Whitefish Lake? Are there people we can talk to? Who are the knowledge keepers that might be able to tell us more about the history? Who are the Métis knowledge keepers that we might be able to talk to about lobstick settlement? A lot of the land that was once lobstick Métis settlement is now no longer Métis owned. I don't know when that property changed hands or why it changed hands. Was that part of the history of scrip, which has its own legacy of colonial disenfranchisement of Métis people in Alberta? I don't know. So these are directions that this project is starting to take. So it's been a progressive moving outward from my own approach to wanting to make site-specific work, to the trees and the animals, to the trees and the animals and the farm itself, to the trees, the animals, the farm itself, the history of homesteading, and now to the history of the whole area and our relations and relationships to the Métis, to the Indigenous peoples of the area, and our own roles as settlers, both Janny and I. But in the end, it all comes back to the trees. This is a photograph that I shot not far from the farm, just on one of the range roads, and that no trespassing sign just got me. You know, there's the range road and the township road, that Dominion land survey, and there's that no trespassing sign, and that relationship to land, the idea that somehow we can cut this up and carve it up and own it, rather than have a completely different relationship to it that is more about reciprocity and less about us and them, is something that I am grappling with and that I continue to grapple with. And it comes back to the Carigana and what the Carigana means. You know, it's such a tremendous signifier of resilience. That tree is incredibly tough. It's invasive. It survives. You can cut it right down to the ground, and that rootstock will spring back to life within a season. So it's this tremendous symbol of resilience, not only for the settler populations that came here and homesteaded. And I don't for a minute want to diminish the tremendous work that it took to do that. But the other side of that coin is that the invasiveness of that Carigana also strikes me as a signifier of the invasiveness of colonial practices that can threaten the erasure of other parallel histories. So this is going to take me a lot of places, and I'm really excited about that. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now. So this is taking me a lot of places, and some of the things that I want to start exploring, in addition to the huge amount of research that I have to do still, are things like ink making. Can I make ink from the humus, this really beautiful, rich humus that's in that grove, that is from the leaves and from the deadfall? Can I make charcoal from dried branches? Can I make maps with that ink and with the charcoal? Can I bring the trees and the land together in exploring all the different layers of the history and the narrative of the place? How can I use time-based media? More video work for sure, more audio work for sure. How can I better use time-based media to explore that kind of history? How can that history and how can my relationship as a settler be actively reflected in the work that comes out of this process going through? So way more questions than answers. And it's been an exciting journey so far, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it takes me. And I'm really interested to hear what other people think and feedback and ideas. I'm really open to that. So thank you very much again. Let's talk. I think that's pretty much all I've got for now.
Thanks so much, Sydney. Thank you so much. That was really great. I wanted to I know there's a few more questions in the chat, but I'll just start off with one question. When you were talking in the early part of the lecture, there was a lot of play and a lot of joy and a lot of intuition, right? There was this element of just, again, that idea of building forts, or just the joy of being in the landscape. And then there's this other aspect of the work that is really research-based and really serious and really fraught, right? It's complicated, really complicated. And I'm just wondering how you negotiate that on any given day. Like how do you engage with both, or how do you trade off? When do you know when to start one and begin another? You know,
I think,
or are they together? Like, will they ultimately come together? I don't know. I just feel like there's those things happening simultaneously.
Absolutely. And it's become kind of, the deeper I've dug, the more sort of schizophrenic it feels in some ways. But I think a lot of it is coming back to the trees, always coming back to the trees. And what that's sort of become my pivot, and also working very hard to be present in whatever moment I'm in. So when I'm working in the trees, it's about talking to the trees, about making spaces and talking to the trees, and getting inside that wonder. It's a really interesting thing to be inside those structures, because even when there's trucks going by, very close by on the range road, or stuff going on in the farmyard, it's still, there's a stillness inside these tunnels and rooms that makes it kind of a world apart. So it's a very interesting space to make work and to think and to get back to the idea of working in concert, really working deeply in concert with a specific place and a specific moment. The other thread of that is taking that step back and recognizing my human intervention in that place. However minimal it is still an intervention. So that's where all the layers of that social and political history come into play. But the Caragana Grove wouldn't be there to create the magic without those social and political interventions, right? Without the homesteaders who brought the Caragana, I wouldn't be making that work. So it does come together.
Definitely, for sure.
But yeah, I mean, as I say, it is in process. I have no idea where it's all going to go yet.
There's just about being in the land and working there. There's just kind of a practical question, I think, from someone who I think knows you well, Ingrid Percy. I think you would know. It says, how do you plan to continue on this work after you relocate to Atlantic Canada? And if so, how will your engagement with the project and the site change?
Well, that's going to be interesting. I'm wondering if I've found oftentimes, because I've been working on other projects in Atlantic Canada over the last few years, when I go away and work on other projects, I see this project in a new light, because that distance is important. Having that distance is really important. And I think it will come back to what I can take with me in place. So things like developing an ink making practice from the materials. What can I do with that? What can I do with the research that I do that hopefully will lead me to more oral histories of the area and how those narrative layers can be incorporated in making image-based work of one variety or another, whether those are drawings or paintings or video work. There's also sculptural ways that can go too. Coming back to the idea of mirroring, and I see Janny has my friend Janny who owns the farm is in the talk too. We have been talking a lot about ideas of mirroring and the way as human beings we are reflected in our relationship in the landscape, and are there ways that I could literally use mirrors in the space to somehow talk about those relationships? Could there be excerpts of stories or something on mirrors in the space so that you could move through it and see yourself reflected, but also see the history simultaneously? So there's lots of things that are sort of swirling around in my thinking right now. So our non-chat question, Scott wants to know.
There's a question here from Maria Lanton, who, it's just a question actually about the trees. It says the trees seem to have natural groupings. Is that characteristic of that type of tree or something about that land? The paths and alcoves you've highlighted within the work are wonderful. So yeah, I guess it's like a question about how much you're manipulating the trees or how much they're to naturally grow in that way.
Yeah, they are as I found them.
Okay.
So they would have been originally probably 2 rows of trees planted offset, sort of in a like, here we go, sort of like that. I don't know if you can see that.
Okay. Yep.
Right, sort of like that, because that's how they normally plant shelter belts. So there would have been sort of one single row between two rows of plants. But over the years, these things cast seed. They have these little pea pods, and every fall those pea pods dry and cast seed everywhere. So over the years, there are just seeds that have taken and become trees. And I mean, they're 20 feet tall. Normally, these are hedges that are, like 5 feet, 6 feet, but they've been let to go. So they are as I found them. There were 1 or 2 roots that were removed very early on when Jenny and Mark were doing some preliminary work on the farm, but I've left the space basically as it is. So it hasn't really been manipulated except for collecting the deadfall and weaving the branches. And that was something that I wanted right from the outset, was to, like, this is the place, I have to have a dialogue with it as it is. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Pretty interesting.